I think we're getting a little bit of static there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still a little staticky, but getting a little bit of static there. That sounds better. I'm not hearing anything.
Okay.
Give it another couple minutes for people who are on the chat. Let me just send them the document. And the Zoom address. Give it a few minutes for people to filter in through one medium or the other. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any additional comments or problems through the other portals, so I guess we are going to go ahead and start. A reminder to those of you who are watching through YouTube Live, welcome. I'm actually in the future by the time you hear this. If you would like to be in the present with me, or the future, depending upon your relative position and time, please join us through the Zoom link. For all of our participants, you are welcome to join us in Sefaria for the 10th chapter of the book of Numbers, and we'll be starting up on verse 29. Please remember that you can ask questions or interject in text or talk if you're on Zoom at any time, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. So, as is often the case, we decided that we were setting out from Mount Sinai when we began the book of Bamidbar. That was 9 chapters ago, and we still haven't exactly left. So it takes a while to get things underway. And that is going to be how we begin on verse 29, because before we can go, we also have to make sure we know who's going with us. And there is a person who has been hanging around for a little while that Moses has to extend an invitation to. And this is his father-in-law, Zipporah's father, more famously known as Yitro or Jethro, is also known as Chovav, and sometimes Reuel, depending upon how you translate different titles and names. So here on verse 29, Moses is having a conversation with him. Moses said to Chovav, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, "We are setting out for the place of which the Lord has said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will be generous with you, for the Lord has promised to be generous to Israel. So it seems here that Moses is extending an invitation to his father-in-law to travel with the people of Israel. Now, there's a little bit of a debate of whether or not Yitro had converted or will eventually convert. But for him to come, if he was converted, would be automatic. For him to come if he's not converted, then this is a very gracious statement by Moses that he is extending a place within the blessing that we will receive in the land of Israel to his father-in-law as well. I should remind those who are not familiar with this particular section and its timeline that at this moment, it looks like Israel is only a short ways away. It will unfortunately turn out with the episode of the spies that we will delay our entry by a very long time, about 40 years. So at this point, the offer is a very good offer that is coming in the immediate future. But Chovav, Yitro, says in response, "I will not go," he replied to him, "but will return to my native land," meaning he is heading back to Midian. He is heading back to the land of the Midianites. He said, meaning Moses, "Please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness and can be our guide. So if you come with us, we will extend to you the same bounty that the Lord grants us." So it's a very interesting point here of Moses is asking his father-in-law for guidance through the wilderness of Sinai. Remember, this is not a well-traveled area, but certainly some of the Midianites, Moses included, would have traveled through its wastelands. But there is an underlying bit of confusion, because why would he need for his father-in-law to be his guide? Why would he need him to be their eyes? Yes, he does know the places within the wilderness, but you know who else knows the places in the wilderness? God. And it is God that is guiding us, as we're going to be reminded of in just a minute. So extending the request to his father-in-law, not as a gift, but as an ask, as a please do us this favor, seems awfully surprising, since it should be no problem to travel if you have God as your guide. We've got a text over here. John McFeely is asking, maybe you missed my quick introduction, Chovav is generally considered to be Yitro because that is Moses's father-in-law. That relationship is much clearer. And so this is considered to be another name for him. The fact that Reuel also can sometimes be used as a name for Yitro gets us into the wonderful world of complicated names in the Bible. Which is beyond the scope of our discussion today. But we are following the general thrust of the commentaries, which see this and Yitro, Jethro, as being the same person. So there are a couple of different explanations. We're not going to go into this in much depth in our commentaries, so I'll just share with you, there are a couple of different explanations here of why he would speak to his father-in-law this way. And one answer is that he was worried that his father-in-law would feel that he was not being useful, that he was not helpful to the nation, and therefore sort of superfluous. But by giving him this offer, by saying, please come with us because we need you, Moses was perhaps telling a little white lie. He wasn't looking to him as being the literal guide. That job was already taken by God. But certainly having an additional advisor wouldn't hurt, so it's not exactly a falsehood. And certainly this would make his father-in-law feel more useful to the nation rather than just a hanger-on and someone who was benefiting from the blessing without having participated in the formation of the nation. However, it doesn't say explicitly what happens at this point. It is often thought that he did continue, and others will contend that he did not continue with them, instead going back to Midian in order to try and continue to convince them to move towards the path of God. But the journey of the main body does continue unambiguously in verse 33. They marched from the mountain of the Lord a distance of 3 days. The ark of the covenant of the Lord traveled in front of them on that 3 days journey to seek out a resting place for them. And the Lord's cloud kept above them by day as they moved on from camp. So we know from other portions of the Tanakh that the ark would be at the vanguard, at the spear point to the travel. And so just a second, Roy says, perhaps he was just being gracious indeed. Many people see in this as being an example of Moses's great humility and kindness to others, his treatment of his father-in-law being something that we should emulate. That finding ways to help other people feel useful is not an insult if there is something that they can do, and it will give them a better feeling of participating in the endeavor. So, like I said, the ark was always at the vanguard as we traveled through the wilderness. It was showing us the way. This is reminding us that the cloud would still be with us to show us our way, even if the ark was 3 days in front, that the ark was 3 days ahead. Now, 3 days in front may seem awfully far, but remember, you're talking about a huge mass of people moving, and the general mass of people all the way to the back would have been moving at a slow pace. Anybody who's ever been in a parade knows that by the time the first float is finishing the parade, the last float may just be leaving the warehouse because you can't have them all going at the same time if you have such a large entourage. So 3 days worth of moving would allow the first to arrive while the remainder were then catching up. Think of it like a very, very long slinky, a 3 days long slinky of walking. You pull out the front, and by the time the front is in place, the back is catching up. And then you would camp, and then you would prepare for the next leg of the journey. And the whole idea here is that this is showing us the way, that it is heading right towards the border of Israel, and that the cloud is still with us to show us where we need to be. And then in verses 35 and 36, we're going to get two very famous lines that I hope will sound familiar. When the ark was to set out, Moses would say, "Advance, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and may your foes flee before you." So I just want to do a couple clarifications on the Hebrew here, because unfortunately, when we get to our commentary, if you read only this English translation, you won't understand some of the issues. So first of all, the idea advance, O Lord, is kuma Adonai, which means or rise up, God. And then we have our enemies being scattered. Hello?
Oh, sorry, I just was singing the song. I apologize.
No, don't apologize. I'm going to be singing it in just a second. You've absolutely hit on where this is in our service. You're just a little ahead of the presentation. I just wanted to clarify the translation before giving people the melody reminder.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. You taught me well.
So for the second word here, rather than translating it as foes, we're going to see many of our translators will be, our commentators will be a little more literal, and they're going to translate misanecha as our enemies. As the ones who hate you, which as our enemies is not an unreasonable translation, as our foes is not wrong, but the fact that this second category are the ones that hate God is going to be important as we uncover some of our different themes through the discussion. Now, as Michelle already gave a little bit of a hint for, this section comes at the beginning of the Torah service. When we open up the ark for the first time, after the preliminaries on Shabbat or on a weekday, it is more immediate. And you may recognize the melody if I just sing it for you. Vayehi bin soa Haaron, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai, ve'afutzu hoivecha, ve'hanusu misanecha mipanecha. And you're probably getting ready to say, Ki mitzion, but that's not what comes next. Instead, what comes next is verse 36. And when it halted, meaning the ark, he would say, Return, O Lord, you who are Israel's myriads of thousands. Uvnucho yomar, or as we might hear it in the service, Uvnucho yomar. And then we usually continue on the next part of the line privately before we get to the ki lekachto. Now, if I was in class, I would love to look around the table and point at people and put you on the spot and make you very uncomfortable. Where does that second section come? Well, that second section comes at the very end of the Torah service. These are usually roughly about an hour apart. We have Vayehi bin Soa Ha'aron at the very beginning, and we have Uvnucho Yomar at the very end. And in between, we have the Torah and Haftarah, if it is a Haftarah day, and any of the other sections of the Torah service that are normally included. So in the Torah, they are two parts that are next to each other. In the service, they are bookends that bracket the Torah service. Now, there's a very powerful message that our liturgy is trying to give us here. First and foremost is that when we are reading from the Torah, it is as though the ark is going before us, that we are following God, we are going in the direction that God has journeyed. It is also telling us that as we read the Torah and learn from it and from the Nevi'im, from the prophets through the Haftarah, that we are journeying, we are moving, right? We are advancing in some way. It is not a static process. It is not just keeping in place and going in circles, even though there is a cycle of reading, but that each time we open the ark, each time we open the Torah, we're moving a little bit forward, or sometimes even a lot forward, depending upon how much we are able to absorb and understand in that particular reading. So this bookend is a very interesting device that the liturgy has given us. And if you are familiar with these verses, you will see how clever it was of them to separate these two lines by the entirety of the Torah service to give us this sense of we are traveling with the many thousands of Israel together as we read from the Torah. Even though we're sitting in place, even though we're not moving through the wilderness, we are still part of that process. It is a very interesting experience. There is something else, however, that lent it to doing this bookend, which is if you are looking at my screen, or hopefully any version you have with the Hebrew, you will notice that there is a strange little nun in a parentheses here and one here. The samach should not be too unusual. Hopefully you've noticed those from time to time in the Chumash. They are marking where there is a break in a line between one part and the next. And then there's another here. Those, however, the samachs, do not appear in the Torah scroll, except as a gap. The nun, on the other hand, there may not be parentheses in the Torah, but there are these very unusual upside down nuns that bracket these lines in the Torah, which our commentators will, of course, draw our attention to and discuss. All right, so any questions on the basic verses before we dive into our discussion? And we are going to be focusing on verses 35 and 36. So if you have questions from before that, please let me know now so that I can handle them before we dive into our commentary. Just wait for the YouTube lag, or for anyone who's getting up their courage on Zoom to actually unmute and talk. Oh.
Because I thought I was on mute. Sorry.
I'm sorry, you thought it was what?
I thought I was on mute, so I was already saying.
No. It's like I said, it was a perfect, gentle melody underneath what I was saying because it fit perfectly where we were going.
Oh, thanks, Rabbi.
All right, so let's go ahead then and take a look at our commentary. Let me open up that screen. Oh, and there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that on their monitors just fine. So we want to talk first about why is this section bracketed off? And we'll begin with Chizkuni, one of the great commentators. He gives a very good summary of this. Of course, other commentators parallel, but I thought his text was especially clear. So according to Shabbat 116, which is in the Talmud, this paragraph, meaning the part marked by the two nuns, these two verses, in the Torah will be removed and rewritten in the appropriate place. All right, so what do we have here? We have the idea that the rabbis believed that this section of the Torah was not where it was supposed to be, meaning that this section of the Torah in our scroll originally was stated in another part of the Torah, and that it was inserted here instead. We'll talk about why in a second. If so, why was it not written in the proper place to begin with? Good question. It was meant to separate positive occurrences that the people experienced from negative ones, such as the ones we will shortly be reading about. All right, so what are the negative experiences? Well, we just saw 3 days, we're leaving Mount Sinai. That was first of all considered to be a rather negative moment. Leaving Sinai was considered to be both literal and spiritual. Spiritual, meaning we left the physical area of Sinai, but there's also a degradation of our spirit. We are not as spiritually strong as we were, not because Sinai was magic, but because we are turning our attention away from God. And as we turn our attention away from God and away from what we have learned and believed, well, in just the next chapter, we are going to find that the people are going to start griping horribly. This is the beginning of the gripe fest and the whinging and the whining and all the other problems that are about to occur during the book of Bamidbar. And so what the rabbis believed was this section was inserted here to separate our going down away from the spirituality of Mount Sinai and our complaining with all of the problems, so that should not be too overloading, that we shouldn't have just bad, 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 but instead have bad, good, bad, so that there would be a little bit of a break in this process. Which then also leaves, of course, the other question: what is the appropriate place? Where should these two verses have occurred in the Torah? According to Rabbi Yossi, it should have appeared when we read about the flags immediately after verse 21 in our chapter, where the Torah describes the Kahatites as carrying the Holy Ark. He says this is the most logical place, that we talk about them lifting up the Ark. You would naturally think the next line should be, and when the Ark would go, this is what would happen. But in order to give us a break, this was separated into another unique spot. And in order to remind us that this is not in its proper place, these backwards nuns were written in order to give us that indication. Questions or comments? Double checking YouTube tab, double checking Zoom.
I find it interesting that, it separated good and bad, because, hopefully Hashem remembers more our good than our bad moments. But we're still going to have those good and bad. So nothing has changed, even though it's been so many thousands of years. But, the hope is that we still somehow keep, increasing on our good, basically. Is what I kind of think about when you started talking about how the rabbis saw it as a division between good and bad, and an incredible experience coming from such a high moment of spiritual uplifting and perfection and beauty, with our Hashem, and then we're just being human beings again,
Well, and that's, the fact that we are still the type of human beings that our ancestors were is sometimes a little discouraging. We haven't improved over them. On the other hand, they did amazing things. With all of their flaws, they still accomplished a lot. And that means the Torah that was a good guide for them is still a good guide for us. And we still need to hear its same message. And like you said, one of the main messages right now that the rabbis is trying to draw our attention to is that it's actually important to have both good and bad, that you don't have a perspective of only one. You don't only look for the good and you don't only think about the bad. You recognize that it's a mixed lot, and that is an important perspective.
Yes.
Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
this may be little, but after such a big statement, but who are the Canaanites?
Oh, that's one of the sub tribes and the Levites. One of the clans.
Oh, it's a subdivision. So it's a subdivision, and they were the ones who carried the ark.
Exactly. That particular clan was the one with that responsibility. Different clans had responsibilities for carrying the menorah, or for taking care of the tent, or taking care of the wood and things like that. And this one had the responsibility for carrying the ark.
Oh,
That's described
okay,
in more
thank
detail earlier in the book of Bamidbar in Numbers. It's not exactly what most people consider the most interesting part of the book, but yes, it is described a few chapters ago.
Rabbi, is the reason why the gentleman that touched, I can't remember who it was, that he touched the ark because they were carrying it, and he saw that it was moving, and he actually touched it, and he died in the process of carrying the ark. Is that part of the reason why? Because Hashem had said only these people can carry it?
Exactly. And the thing is, they weren't actually carrying it at the time. There was a bigger mistake than him just touching it.
Okay.
David had actually had a cart to carry the ark when they were taking it up to Jerusalem for the first time. And that was definitely a problem. And so when it began to fall off the cart, and Uzzah went up and touched it, and then was struck down. Yes, it was because he was not allowed to, but the only reason he was in a position to have made that infraction was because David had misplanned the transportation of the ark. And then it says very soon afterwards that when they decide to go ahead and resume the carrying or moving the ark to the Jerusalem, they actually carry it this time. And lo and behold, no problems.
Okay.
It turns out actually that carrying things sometimes can be safer than rolling them. All right, so let's go ahead and see what Sforno says about all of this idea of why would they have been saying, rise God and scatter the enemies. Why was this the phrase for this time? Because it sounds a little aggressive. I know that many people, when they're learning the translations for the first time, they see oivecha and they think, do we have to focus on God beating up our enemies? Doesn't that seem a little bloodthirsty? Well, not exactly. Sforno explains, if the people had not insisted on dispatching the spies, the march would have been proceeding unopposed, the enemies scattering before the armies of God without offering resistance. Right? The idea of they will be scattered doesn't mean they will be destroyed. It means that those that are enemies to God will simply leave. They will run away. And indeed, that's always been throughout the biblical narrative, the ideal for a battle. It's not the ideal is not to kill them all. The ideal is they will run away because they recognize that they will lose, and therefore war will be avoided entirely. And so this idea of scatter the enemies is very much a prayer that there not be any actual conflict, that instead the other people who stand between us and our home will simply give up and leave. Now, Sifrei, the great Midrash collection, one of the earliest ones, has a very interesting metaphor, analogy for how this all should be seen. So some men say to the king, would you please accompany us to the governor of Akko? Right, so notice what's happening here. They're talking to the king, asking him to come with them, right? Because Moses said, Kuma Adonai, rise up, God, right? Be with us. And as we travel. Now they're asking the king to go see the governor with them. So that's asking the king, who's more important than them, to go see the governor, who's less important than the king. And they arrive at Akko, but he, meaning the governor, had gone to Tyre. They arrive at Tyre, and he has gone to Sidon. They arrive at Sidon, and he has gone to Antiochia. And they arrive at Antiochia, and some of them start complaining. So what's happening here? they are traveling now with the king. And as they go to these different cities, they find that the governor, you just missed him. He's traveled to this other city. He's doing an inspection there. He's, visiting somewhere else for whatever government reason. And so they're chasing after him, trying to catch up to be able to have the meeting that they're looking for. And the whole time the king is with them. But by the time they get to the next stop and they still haven't gotten where they want to get, they still haven't gotten to the governor, they start complaining against the king for having put them to all of this trouble. Now, notice again, as Michelle had mentioned about humans are still the same. Notice it was their idea to see the governor, and it was their idea to invite the king, but they're now complaining that somehow it was the king that was causing the trouble. Now, the parallel, before we get to the rest of it, the parallel to our story, of course, is that the Israelites are leaving Mount Sinai, and they are asking that the king accompany. They are very adamant they want God to go with them, meaning the most powerful and palpable presence that they can have as they go off to the land of Israel. But as we're going to find, they're not going to make a straight line to Israel. They are eventually going to have many detours. And as they have those detours, they begin to complain to the king that somehow he's the one causing the detours. But as the Midrash continues, it is the king who should complain for having been put to all this trouble for their sakes. Right? It's not the king causing the detours, it's them causing the detours. Similarly, on that day, the Shekhinah, meaning the presence of God, traveled a 3 days journey, as we saw, so that they could immediately enter Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. So the Shekhinah is gung-ho, it's moved ahead, everyone should be following, and they began to complain before him for having been put to all of that trouble. It is he, if anyone, who should have complained, for it was for their sake that the Shekhinah was thus constrained. Right? The Shekhinah was being forced to guide them and to be with them for their benefit, and they end up complaining that they're not getting there fast enough, that they don't get what they want along the journey. And in the coming chapter, it's specifically about what they're eating on the trip. So it's just mind-boggling that people would complain to the person that they are inconveniencing when it's they causing the inconvenience. But guess what? Humans are humans. This is quite likely exactly how people would behave in that process. However, let me just, did it scroll too much? No, there we are. However, we find out that despite our stupidity, despite our ingratitude, despite all of our ignorance, God still puts up with us. And Derashot Haran is the collection of writings from one of the great commentators. And he tries to give us an understanding of this and some of the interesting emotion that Moses himself must have been feeling. And Moses further intimated this to Israel, meaning that God would forgive them in this parasha, saying, this time from Deuteronomy 3:29, and we sat in the valley opposite Beit Peor, right? So this is one of the areas where we made massive sins with our enemies, which our sages of blessed memory expounded. Moses said to them, see the difference between me and yourselves. How many prayers, petitions, and supplications did I intone, and yet the decree stood fast that I not enter the land, whereas you angered him in the desert for 40 years. As it is written from Psalm 95, part of our Kabbalat Shabbat service, it's the end of the Lechuna Ranana Psalm. 40 years was I angry with this generation. And what is more, the greatest among you bowed down to Peor. And now Israel, you are new. The past has been forgiven. So Moses is having a bit of a go at them, saying, you guys sinned massively for 40 years. I messed up once, and I don't get to go to Israel. But you, the nation, you do get to go to Israel. That doesn't seem fair. God forgives you, but he isn't forgiving me. It is therein made clear that Moses saying, and we sat in the valley, is not by way of rebuke, right? Although it sounds like that, he's not actually chastising them. He's not being angry at them, but not to reprove them for the episode of Peor, but to the contrary, it is stated here to reveal to them their greatness. that though their leaders committed a grave sin, they are still more beloved by the Lord than he is, meaning than Moses is, meaning that God loves Israel more than God loves Moses. And the reason for this is that the congregation, by virtue of its plurality, attains an eminence which is greater than the sum of its parts, as nature itself demonstrates, right? Israel is more than just a collection of individuals with all of their good and bad parts. Collectively, Israel is amazing. Collectively, Israel has a status and a potential that is beyond that of any individual, even and up to including Moses. And that is why our willingness to eventually return, eventually make amends, and eventually follow God, that eventually gets us into the land of Israel. Whereas Moses, as a single person, did not have the ability to overcome the decree that had been put against him. Questions and comments? I know that one's a lot to take in. All right, but we're going to go ahead and move on to this idea, though, about this plurality of Israel, this number of us. Excuse me. Moses would say when the cloud came to rest above the tabernacle, may the hundreds of thousands of Israelites rest in this place without diminishing in numbers. May their next departure find them without any of them being absent or missing. So this is going back to the rather unusual phrase that, again, we normally say privately, but at the end of the Uvnucho Yomar, verse 36, it says, Shuvah Adonai, return, O Lord, Rivavot Alfei Yisrael, right? The myriads of thousands is a common translation, or the many of minis, because they're both different words meaning lots, depending upon how you want to translate them. And the question is, what do you mean by the many of minis of Israel? And the idea here is that what Moses is saying is that God will protect all of these hundreds and thousands of the Israelites, so that when it's time to move on to the next step, they will still be there, right? No one will be lost. Everyone will still be part of the group. But this literal translation is going to then get us into a very interesting question about the Shekhinah, about what does it mean that God is with these hundreds and thousands. Scroll down to this collection, quote from the Talmud. The sages taught with regard to the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, meaning to have children. And when it rested, he would say, return, Lord, to the 10,000s of the thousands of Israel. Another way to translate verse 36. This teaches that the divine presence does not rest upon less than 2,000s and 10,000s of the Jewish people, as the term thousands and 10,000s are both in the plural. This is a very common midrashic move, meaning that if you have the phrase rivavot, which is a plural, then that must be a plural number. And if you have the phrase, alfei Yisrael, then alpaim is a plural number, or alafim is a plural number. So therefore, a minimum to be a plural is 2, right? It takes 2 to be plural. It takes 2 to multiply as well, which is kind of their point here. So that means that God would come and rest upon the camp because there were at least these 2 10,000s and 2,000s, meaning 22,000 people. That's a pretty big crowd. Consequently, if there were 2,000 and 2 10,000s of the Jewish people, 22,000, less 1, meaning there were 21,999 people, and this man, meaning one of the people, did not engage in the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, is he not found to have caused the divine presence to be departed from the Jewish people? So what the rabbis are hinting at here is, if you have the ability to have children and you have selfishly chosen not to, then you are maybe tipping the balance between whether God is here or God is not. That if you and your wife and your kids could have added us up to 22,000, and you chose not to, again, for no good reason, then you are depriving us all of experiencing the fullness of God's presence. And Abba Hanan said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, a man who does not engage in procreation is liable to death. He didn't mean that literally. It didn't mean bachelors had to be executed. As it is stated with regard to the sons of Aaron, and Nadav and Avihu died, and they had no children. Meaning that as we hear about their death, when they are bringing the incorrect offering to the tabernacle, we also are given as a side that they had no kids. This indicates, he argues, that if they would have had children, they would not have died. Now, there's a couple ways to understand this. First, I should point out in context, the fact that they had no children is more implying to us why there are no other ones from their family that are mourning for them, and also why their children do not appear in the list of those who become Kohanim, who become among the priestly class. However, what he's trying to draw our attention to is that they died without children, implies that with children they wouldn't have died. Doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't have actually physically died, but had they had children, then they would not have ever truly died. Meaning that those who contribute to the building of the world through the creation of a new generation of life, even when they pass from this world, they are never done because they have created something that will continue to be an ongoing part and presence of this world. That gives them a type of immortality that is simply not attainable in other ways.
Rabbi, this might be a little.
So this is early DNA.
Not necessarily DNA in the sense of passing on genetic material, because the rabbis were perfectly aware of the power for a person to influence the world without their genes. It's more the idea, though, that for most people, the most powerful and most at-hand means of influence in the world and the way of leaving a permanent mark was by having and raising good kids. Michelle, did you have something else to add?
No, I was thinking that I was not sure if after the Israelites went into Israel, there was no longer mention of the angel that was, protecting them on their way there. And I don't know if there was any mention from the rabbis saying that, that angel either went back to heaven or is still incorporated within Israel or what. It just made me think about that, because on your way to Israel, yes, Hashem gave you some, rules on what to follow. But I was curious to see, those wonderful, the Shekinah, the wonderful miracles that were constantly with them, right? That some of them were angels that were guarding them. I don't recall hearing anything in the Tanakh about what happened to them, but I was curious to see if you knew anything that might have been written by the rabbis.
So the cloud of glory and the pillar that guided us, those stop when we cross the Jordan River and enter into the land, and then it is up to us to fulfill the commands we've been given. We don't need additional GPS. We just need to actually do what we're supposed to do now that we've arrived at our destination.
And we received the Torah. Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
The Shekhinah, on the other hand, that does get a number of different commentaries and ideas throughout the rabbinic literature, because obviously the rabbis here talking about the idea with the Shekhinah being among the 22,000 is nice, but you're not always with a crowd of 22,000 people. And they have different ways of talking about the Shekhinah's presence. And in fact, the lowest they get to is the Shekhinah dwells among two, if those two are talking about Torah. Meaning that if you are with your friend and you're sharing an insight about Torah, then the Shekhinah, God's presence, is there with you. That happens as well with three when it comes to Birkat Hamazon and other such calculations. So the rabbis here are making a point about the importance even of one person out of 22,000, and you might have thought one person is not important, that each person is very important. And then they also make the scale move the other direction to say, even if you're only by yourself and one other person, you can still have that presence with you if you are willing to engage in Torah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I believe that 100%. Yes.
All right, so let's just move on a little bit about this whole idea of fighting and having this protection. Right? This is a prayer that if enemies will gather to attack the Israelites, they should be dispersed by God before carrying out their plans. That's the first idea of send them, rout your enemies. Rout your enemies. Yes. If for some reason they had already succeeded in massing, meaning you do actually have an army and you have a fight on your hand, then those that hate you, God, those ones should be set to flight, right? Mipanecha, from before you, they should be sent running. So the idea is here that he's saying it's a two-part blessing, not just one. It is saying, don't let them gather against us. And if they do gather against us, make them run away before they can do any damage. So just a nice reminder of how, even though a verse may seem to be repeating itself between part A and part B, in fact, each part can have its own important interpretation. Now, the second that I want to talk about here is a selection taken from the Kuzari. The Kuzari was written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Middle Ages, and it's a very interesting philosophical and pseudo-historical work. It is purported to have been a dialogue between an unnamed rabbi and the Khazars of the what would now be part of like the Ukrainian-Russian steppes, where there was this idea that there was a kingdom that had converted en masse to Judaism, and the Kuzari is attempting to recreate the conversations that would have led to that mass conversion by the king and the subjects. The interesting thing about the Kuzari is that it is written in a way that is very pro-Israel, as you might gather, since he sees it as being a competition between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And obviously he thinks Judaism wins. But it is also very much what somebody who is sick and tired and fed up with being told you're a second-class citizen by the Christians and by the Muslims for, at this point, hundreds of years in each of those zones, would want to say to their faces. That is to say, you can hear a great deal of anger throughout the Kuzari. He makes many amazingly good points, but many of his points are also very much coming from a place of deep resentment at the persecution, exploitation, and oppression that the Jews have felt under Christian and Muslim rule. So with that in mind, you'll maybe be able to understand a bit more clearly how he is going to define these haters of the Lord. By haters of the Lord are meant those who hate the name or covenant or the law of God. Remember, the name meaning God's name is God's essence, not merely God's title. And the covenant meaning the covenant between us and God, and the law of God, of course, meaning the Torah. For there exists no connection between God and any other nation, as he pours out his light only on the select people. They are accepted by him and he by them. He is called the God of Israel, whilst they are the people of the Lord and the people of the God of Abraham. All right, so as I said, this is a guy who was angry with Christians coming along and saying, you don't have God's blessing anymore. God's blessing has been transferred to the Christian nations. And by the Muslims coming along and saying, you don't have God's blessing anymore. God's blessing has been transferred to the Muslim nations. And Yehuda Halevi is saying, you know what? I'm sick and tired of hearing this. And I'm sick and tired of you telling me that I should be upset and offended that we are called the chosen people, when you are saying that you have decided you're the new chosen. How dare you consider us to be arrogant for calling ourselves chosen? In fact, I'm going to own it. I'm going to say we are the only people. Now, obviously, from many, many other quotes that we have gone through in this class over the years, we have seen that from the Torah and the prophets and all the way through rabbinic literature, of course, God is with and God cares about the entirety of the world. However, it is certainly understandable, if I was living in the Middle Ages, I might have felt this way too, that all those other nations that claimed exclusive ownership of God and continued to oppress us, I might want to just thumb my nose at them a little bit if I'm writing my book. So he goes on to continue this idea. Even supposing some nations had followed him and worshiped him, their conversion being the result of hearsay and tradition, meaning imagine somebody just heard about Judaism and decided to try and do it on their own. Yet where do we find his acceptance of them and his connection with them, his pleasure in their obedience, his anger for their disobedience? Meaning, do we see that God embraces these other random people who decide to become Jewish-like? No, nowhere in the Tanakh does it say God says, good job. We see them left to nature and chance by which their prosperity or misfortune are determined, but not by an influence which proves to be of divine origin alone. Meaning, yeah, sometimes people might do this and they might do okay, they might do bad, but if they do okay or do bad, it's just a roll of the dice. It's just luck. God isn't protecting them, God isn't helping them. Whereas he's arguing that among the Jewish people, the fact that we have continued to exist despite the persecution and oppression by these other nations proves that there is something more to our connection with God than you might think, because without God's help, there's no way we could have survived. Thus also we alone are meant in the words, so the Lord alone did lead him, and there was no strange God with him. The Tetragrammaton, God's four-letter name, is a name exclusively employable by us, as no other people know its true meaning. And this I have to say, actually, although I disagree with much of the underlying content of his early section, although I certainly appreciate his frustration, this last line is something I absolutely agree with, and it drives me crazy when I see non-Jewish people trying to use God's name in non-Jewish rituals or other types of their own worship ceremonies. Right? The Yud He Vav He is not a toy to just be bandied about and used as decoration for some other worship. It is a very specific, very meaningful concept that demands very careful study and very deep understanding. And quite frankly, those who throw it around in inappropriate settings are doing themselves a great disservice and are really diminishing the importance of God's name. It's ours, hands off.
Rabbi Yehuda Halevi really did experience both the pressure of Christianity coming through Spain and at the same time the oppression of Islam react back and forth. So, I mean, it must have been terribly confusing. You know, one day you're with the in group, the next day you're on the outside and there's no one. And it must have been extremely frustrating for someone of his intellect and his beautiful poetry to realize how frustrating that is. You're always on the outside, no matter what you do. And he turned it around.
And that's what's, so funny. I mean, so many people will criticize some parts of the Kuzari for their essentially chauvinism, their very Israelite-focused theme. But what he was writing here was mild compared to what was being written against the Jews and against the Muslims or Christians by the opposite throughout this time period. All he was trying to do was say, you know what, we actually do have a special connection to God. And for that, people will roundly criticize him. But I do consider that to be a strength of the Jewish people, that we have shied away from chauvinism by and large. And although we definitely consider that we have a particular relationship with God, that we guard jealously and do not like to see other people appropriate and misuse, we do not really on our best days believe that only the Jewish people are blessed by God. We may be blessed in a particular way, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't care about the rest of God's creatures. But I certainly understand why someone, especially like you said in Yehuda Halevi's position, would have just said, enough, all right, guys, you're constantly being horrible and mean. It's my turn to say that I think I'm special, all right, because I'm sick and tired of you saying you're the special ones and then stomping on us.
I'm kind of glad he did, because he didn't compromise in any way, and or apologize for being Jewish and standing for what the Torah says. I think it was just exactly what the moment needed, someone to stand up and just say it. Because if he wouldn't have done that, and I think if somehow they would just not address it, then the anti-Semitism could have gotten even worse. I think the fact that he stood up and said it kind of shut him up a little bit.
Well, I'm not sure the anti-Semites ever read the Kuzari, and if they did, they were in a position to completely ignore it because of the power imbalance they had. It was more for trying to strengthen a little bit of pride within the Jewish nation. And at that, it still is often very inspiring. I know many people who are returning to Judaism, having drifted away from it, will often find the Kuzari to be a useful portal. I know I did when I was, first connecting to Judaism as a young adult. It was nice to see somebody speak full-throated, joy and praise at being Jewish. I have since learned, as I mentioned, that many of his more outlandish statements are not supported by the rest of rabbinic literature. He is perhaps overemphasizing the uniqueness of Israel to the detriment of God's connection to the rest of the world. But for a certain time, for certain people, it was and is still a very important message. I just want to finish up. There we are. Just scroll down there. With our last two comments about this whole idea of those who hate Israel, because I don't want to stop with just the generic version that the Kuzari gives us, because both the rabbis through the Midrash, here quoted through Rashi, and also through Rabbeinu Bachya, are going to give us a different way to understand this problem of who is it that hates God. Rashi first, again, coming from the Midrash, these are those who hate Israel, meaning the Sonecha, those who hate God are the ones who hate Israel, because whoever hates Israel hates him who spoke and the world came into existence, right? Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. As it says in Psalm 83, and they that hate you have lifted up the head. And who are these that hate you? The next verse states this, verse 4, they who have taken crafty counsel against your people. So what the Sifrei here, Rashi is bringing, is trying to tell us is that if you want to know who hates God, find the people who hate the Israelites, who hate Jews, right? Because anybody who claims to love God, but who hates the Jewish people, doesn't actually love God, right? They have gotten their head screwed on backwards. And we can see this very clearly. It points out from Psalm 83 that those who hate you, God, are the ones who are plotting against your people. And so it's not the same level of chauvinism as the Kuzari. Instead, it is flipping it around to say, it's not to say that God doesn't like other people. It's to say God recognizes that those who hate the Jews also hate him, even if they themselves don't say it out loud, and sometimes are so deluded they don't even recognize that to hate the Jewish people is to also hate God. And then Rabbeinu Bachya is going to give us a different, more generic and philosophical view of what does it mean to hate God and why this is given to us at this particular point. We know that the world is divided into the three parts: sea, civilized areas, and desert. And indeed, the rabbis even teach that the world is pretty much 1/3 of each of those. The Israelites had a visible manifestation of the fact that God created the world, as God had demonstrated miracles both on sea, on desert, and the land of Canaan, right? The sea, when we cross through the sea. On the desert, this is the whole discussion of the Midbar, of the wilderness experience, and the land of Canaan, the civilized area. I should point out, desert here doesn't mean dunes and sand. Desert here means a place that is uninhabited. that is not built up for civilization. And civilization doesn't necessarily mean a great place to live. It just means a place where people have towns and farms and such things. Seeing that when one comes face to face in nature with high mountains and other forms of the natural beauty, one forms the impression that these have existed for eons and have preceded man and God. It is necessary to counter such impressions among the people. But it isn't unusual when someone sees the ocean or sees a huge mountain to feel timelessness. But timelessness, especially in ancient philosophy, was a way of thinking that there was a creation that existed before God. And that is what he is arguing against. That yes, we should think of these as being ancient, and we should definitely think of these as being impressive, but we shouldn't think of them as being before God. Right? It is necessary. This is why the Torah inserted the two verses at this point. Remember, we talked at the very beginning that these are sort of floating verses that have been moved around in the text. It was inserted at this point as it had become aware of the impression that the wilderness had begun to make on the Israelites. Meaning, we've been in the desert now for 2 years. We've been at Mount Sinai for 2 years. We have, yes, experienced God, but we're also experiencing the natural wonders. And that may be loosening our understanding of which came first, God or the world. And that means we need to be reminded. The words, "May your enemies scatter and those who hate you be put to flight," are aimed at the people who believe that the forces of nature are more powerful than God. Right? So this is not about fighting our external enemies, although certainly some of them had these beliefs. It is also about fighting that belief within us, that anything that draws us to a position that we think there is something greater than God, something that preceded God, something that created God, then we need to send that running from us and get our mind back on track. And with that, we will bring it to an end. I'll give a couple minutes for additional comments and questions for people to catch up on YouTube. Thank you as always for studying. I'll remind you that we don't have class for the next 4 weeks, next 4 Wednesdays, because I will be on vacation. All right. Take care, everyone, and be well.